Welcome. In this video, we're going to begin exploring events. Events allow us to find out when certain actions take place and then run our own code. There are a few common types of events. We have mouse events, like on click or when a mouse rolls over a certain object. We have keyboard events for finding out what keys are pressed. Form events for when forms are submitted, focusing on certain elements, or updating things when certain elements in a form change. We could even do extended validation with forms, which is quite common. We have media events, which allow us to determine whether a media is playing, paused, or at a certain point, or to control media programmatically. Drag and drop events, which allow us to drag elements around the page and determine where they can be dropped and what happens when we drop them. We have window events that let us determine when something is loaded into the window, or when it's resized, or dealing with things like scrolling. Plus many more. We could copy things to the clipboard, work with printing, there are touch and transition events, and even speech recognition in some browsers. Thanks to the DOM API, it's possible to hook in our own custom JavaScript whenever one of these events occurs. There are actually some pretty important mechanisms to know about working with DOM events in JavaScript, but before we get into these in detail, I want to show you a little bit of what's possible with a few examples. In our first example here, we're hooking into the event of whenever a mouse moves. Then we're taking the information from the mouse movement and displaying it onto the page, both the X and Y positions. So now when I hover over my page, anywhere I go, I'm going to begin seeing the mouse moving and its exact position. In our next example, we're going to look at what happens when you mouse over, enter into, or leave a certain position in the browser. So what we're doing here is selecting our child element and then hooking in all of our events onto that child element. Then we could write custom functions that tell us what to do when we mouse over, enter into, or leave over top of this child element. So now you can see when I hover over it, notice that it says mouse over and mouse enter. If I keep moving around, it tells me, hey, you're still over this object. And then if I move out, it tells me the mouse left. Before, when we looked at styling CSS, we found out that we couldn't actually add a style for a hover. However, now we have the ability to, because we could say whenever the mouse moves over a certain element, or whenever the mouse enters a certain element, then go ahead and change the style of the cursor to something. This is the same as doing a hover style. However, we also need to change it back once the mouse leaves. There was a time in web development before CSS became more advanced that a lot of mouse over events were needed in order to style pages. Before we could change the background image and things like that on a hover, a lot of people were creating images for every single link, for example, in their navigation, and then using code like this to swap out images as their main navigation. For accessibility reasons, we know that this is a horrible idea nowadays. However, this was done quite a lot in the past. So you won't see this code used as much anymore, but it's important to know that we do have these capabilities, and when you're writing some custom code, you'll need to do things like this. I also point out these mouse events so that later on when we get to more complex things, you'll understand that behind the scenes, JavaScript knows how to track anywhere the mouse or any other object is, and that could be really helpful for us to tune into. In addition to tracking mouse positions, we could also tell what someone is doing on their keyboard. This could be helpful if you're trying to hack someone's computer and find out what keys they're pressing, or for something more benevolent like trying to create something like Google Docs. Have you ever wondered how they figure out what keys you're pressing and get them into the screen? Well, in this little demo, what we're doing is we're finding out any time in the document that keys are pressed. Then, when that happens, we're running a custom function that's going to figure out what keys are pressed and then update text on the page. You'll notice that we have a little bit of conditional logic here, and when we get into working with events, we'll see even more than before that different browsers handle things differently. Rather though than trying to figure out what browser we're using, what we'll do is write conditional statements based on what specific things are supported or not. So if we know, for example, that this isn't supported without going into what it exactly is, then we know, okay, then we'll run this instead. So what we're doing is we're getting the key, and then we're running another function called update text, which we're passing the parameter of the key and the event that happened. Then we're coming down here, I'm going to turn on console log key so that you could see what keys look like before we convert them to strings. We're also doing some extra code where I have a special function called show shortcuts. What this does is create some document nodes and adds a little text to the page that we'll see down here. Because the other thing that you'll see is that we're using shortcuts that we created to be able to save or clear the code. The real magic happens in here. We figure out if they press this certain thing, then we're going to clear the text. If they do another thing, we're going to mimic saving. If they do a third thing, we'll add a space. And finally, if none of those conditions are met, we're going to take this key and convert it to a string. We haven't really looked at this specifically yet, but it'll begin to make sense once we see all this running. Finally, we're going to take whatever it was that we typed in and then simply add it to the inner HTML of our text container. So while a lot of this is new, some of the basic fundamentals of if statements and creating nodes and then changing the inner HTML is all stuff that we've seen in the past. Now let's see it running. What I'm going to do is start typing. What you'll see is that everything I typed showed up on the page. However, down below you could see that when we logged out console log key, this is the actual key that's being pressed, it has a numeric value. What this tells us is that in JavaScript, when we log a key, unless we convert it into a string using this from car code or char code, then all JavaScript knows is that this is just a numeric value. For example, if I start typing A, notice that it's 97. If I put a space in, that's 32. So that's what allows me here to say if 32 is pressed, then go ahead and add a space. Otherwise, if it's not any of these combinations, 3, 19, or 32, then simply convert it to a string and log it to the page. So what's happening here with 3 is that if I hold down Control on the Mac and press C, it's going to log 3. So what I'm doing whenever 3 is called is I'm simply setting the entire text, which is what we get from the container. Notice that I grabbed the entire container of logged keys. So behind the scenes, there's this paragraph element called logged keys. And then I'm simply grabbing the text content from that, saving it as text, and then I'm going to rewrite it as 0 or add a space or add a new key onto it. So I could keep typing again. Oh, not down there. Keep typing up in the browser. And then if I hold down Control and hit S, I'm going to see 19 is called. So if I have 19, then I'm going to just say save. Now I'm not doing any saving, but we'll learn later on down the road how we can maybe do something server-side with Ajax or something like that. However, this example shows us a couple of great things. One is that we could grab any key that's pressed on the page, and 2, we can convert it or figure out what's going on, including creating our own shortcuts. Now let's move to the next example. Okay, what we've done in this example is we've got our parent element, we grabbed the footer. Notice I'm playing around with different ways of grabbing elements. I could have done query selector and done footer, but I'm using get elements by tag name and then grabbing the first in the array. And this is really just to remind you of all these different ways so that you don't get stuck in just using one way of selecting text. A lot of people will default to just using query selector. However, this approach is technically a little bit faster, and I find it's best to use the most specific method you can in any given situation. So then you'll notice that this element is not actually in the source code. I'm going to create the link myself. So I'm saying create element A and then create text node, and then later on down in the code, I'm going to be creating that. But the last thing I do here is I set the footer Y position. So what I've done is I've created a huge top margin for the footer. I put it way down here. And that's so that we could take a look at some scroll actions. But I didn't do that in my original CSS. So this is to point out, again, some of the cool things you could do with DOM manipulation. You might have a page that looks one way, but then you write a little JavaScript, you add some elements to the page, you change some styling, and you automatically have a completely different thing. So if I comment all this out, notice what happens. The footer comes back up and the link is gone. When I uncomment it all, notice that that link is added and the footer moves its position. So the next thing I'm doing is I'm setting the footer Y position using something new here called getBoundingClientRect, which will give us a lot of information, basically all the information about the position of any given element. So in this case, I'm getting the top position of the footer, which I just set to be way, way down on the page. Then I'm going to, with the link element I created earlier, again, this is nothing new, but it's worth repeating because this is when all the fundamental stuff we looked at in the past becomes really helpful, and it's really important that we know how to, for example, create a link on the fly, set the href equal to a hashtag, which won't go anywhere. I'm adding the class of button dynamically because when you create this link, it doesn't have any classes, and I do have some styling in my CSS for a button. Then I'm going to add my text to the link, and then I'm going to add my link to the paragraph element, which I created up here, and then finally I'll add that paragraph to the page. So none of that was there before, and it is now. Then down below what I have is I grab that link element and I say, hey, whenever somebody clicks on this, run this function of scroll to footer. Then in scroll to footer, what I'm doing is, you'll see that for Chrome, and then I'll show you something in Firefox in a second, I'm saying window, scroll to or scroll by, 0 being left, and the footer Y, the height of the footer, or the Y position, the top of the footer. And what this is going to do, when I click this, is scroll us all the way down immediately to the footer. If I refresh it or hard refresh, click this again, notice I'm bounced all the way down automatically. So you could even do this programmatically. Somebody doesn't even have to click on the link. You could just at a certain point scroll them down the page. Or if you ever wanted to do a navigation where you added something and you clicked on something and it scrolled them down, you could do that without even having anchor tags on your page. Now I'm also running something very important, which we'll look at a bunch in this section, called event prevent default. And what that does is prevent this link from ever clicking. So notice that when I click on this, nothing up here changes. If I were to remove this, notice when I click on this now, that hashtag is added and it doesn't scroll. So there's a lot of times in JavaScript when we need to prevent the default behavior from occurring. And a lot of times with links, we don't want to go anywhere. We just want to run our own code. So that's what that's doing. Now I'm going to comment this out and open up Firefox. And what's happening here is that instead of just saying, hey, I'm passing in the left position and the top position, I'm going to now pass in what's actually technically an object here. We have a group of parameters, right? We have several properties, and it allows for behavior set to smooth. So this is something that you've seen a lot on sites. Click it and it smooth scrolls you down. Again, let's look at it in Chrome. Okay, so in Chrome, we click on it. Oh, I commented it out. Okay, so in Chrome, when we do it, notice that, boom, it drops us immediately. Comment this back. Now we're back up in Firefox. I click on this and a smooth scroll. So that's native smooth scrolling. Because it doesn't work in Chrome, if we wanted to add this, we would have to get into animations, which we'll look at later on in the course. And we'll also look more at how to write one bit of code that you don't have to change or comment out depending on what browser it is. It's just getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. And what I want to draw your attention to is that the window object, again, we have our document, which is the actual page itself. And then we have the window, which is the whole thing, which can control things like scroll and resizing and stuff like that. Okay, in this example, we're going to work with forms, or we're just going to show you an example of some of what you could do with forms. Now, it's quite common to have JavaScript running with forms. although you're also going to need to have server-side stuff running with forms. So this is just a heads up, but in this we're going to show you an example of some of the things you could do with forms. So I'm doing some stuff here just to set things up. I'm removing that child element. I'm changing my header up here to say contact us, and then I have a form on the back end. So I have this whole contact form. I'm not creating that all on the fly. And then I'm just setting it to display block so it shows. Then if I come down to the very bottom here, I select my contact form, and I basically say, when it submits, run this function called process form. Okay? So not all of this code is production ready. I'm just trying to give you an example here of what's possible. But notice what I'm doing. I'm going to get all the form data. This is very simple stuff that you should know how to do. Using get elements by name, right? Because all of these have names attached to them. Name is equal to name. Name is equal to email, etc. But get elements by name, elements, plural is going to give you an array. I know there's only one, so I'm grabbing the first one and then value. This is all stuff we've looked at before. Then I'm going to create a paragraph element, and I'm going to make a thank you message. And on the fly, I'm going to basically say, hey, grab the person's name that I just got. Thanks for your message. We'll get back to you at, and then put out their email. I'm going to log this out just because I was testing it, and that's helpful to do. And then I'm going to take the thank you text node, which we created up here. Oh, that's a capital A. It shouldn't be. It doesn't matter. It'll still work, but we just keep it lowercase. So I'm taking that text node, and then I'm changing the node value to be this thank you message. So you can't just say, for example, take this text node and replace it with a string, because a node is something that's different than a string, but we can do that. Then I'm logging it out again just to test it. And finally, I'm going to take that new text node, append it to the paragraph, and I'm going to remove the contact form, and then I will append my thank you message. And then finally, I'll prevent default, because by default, when you click a submit button, it's going to reload the page, right? But I'm going to prevent that from happening, and I'm just going to hide the form and display my thank you message. So let's open up our console. Let's get some info in there. Then I'm going to click send. And notice the form is gone. I've said, hey, Zach, thanks for your message. We'll get back to you here. And then I've got my message here. I've got my message here just because I was testing it over on here. And like I said, very simple. Now, we'll have to learn later on, or you would have to add on to this, what to do on the back end to send this, or when we get into our AJAX stuff and asynchronous programming or working with the server from the front end, you could also do it that way. But at some point, to send the form, you would need to have some back-end server logic running. So that's just something I want to point out now. And then I also want to mention something that we'll come back to a ton throughout this course, which is validation. Now, we could very easily, in our code, make this stuff required. So that's going to make it so that we can't submit it otherwise. We could also, we have email here, so if I tried to add in, let's make this required. If I tried to put in my name and then double my name, notice that it's going to say, hey, this can't happen. And I could do the same thing there, but there's additional type of stuff we might want to do. We might want to say that, for example, make sure that their name is more than just one character, because if it's just one character, I know you're messing with me. So this is what's called validation. Now, the email validation is done on its own, but if somebody disables JavaScript, we need all of our validation also running on the server side. That's out of the scope of this course, especially at this point. But I do want to point out, though, that when you grab something, let's come back into our JavaScript, we can begin testing it. So you could write some conditional statements like, is name more than one character? Or is it more than two characters? And when you go through and review this at the end of this video, I want you to come back and try to start creating your own simple validation using conditional statements and some of the string testing or string functions or methods that we've looked at early on in this course. Your validation won't be super complex, but try, for example, also taking off the required here. And then if they submit an email form that's empty, display a message. Highlight this in red, display a message up here and say, hey, you need to fill in your email form. Now, you may or may not need to do this, but it's absolutely good practice. So I want you, before proceeding, to try to start writing some conditional statements that test things out. You could determine what it is. Make sure that it's not blank. Make sure that it's a certain length. It's going to be tough for you to figure out if the @ sign is there, but if you want to try to figure that out on your own, you can. So the HTML5 stuff is going to do a lot for you in terms of the type. It knows that the type is email, so it'll check that, and you could add required, but try to do some of that JavaScript yourself, because really in the browser, it's all JavaScript that this browser is writing for you. But that's a simple look at what we could do. Again, I'll just fill it out one last time. We could grab all of the form data, prevent it from being submitted onto the back end, and do whatever we want in the console or here on the front end. So start playing with that a bit more and see what you can come up with. Okay, now in this example, we're going to look at media events. Now, HTML5 video is something that we're not really going to get into, but I do want to show you the source code real quick. So what I've got here is a video with controls turned on, and that's just to help us so we could see the scroll bar, but it'll also work with it out. Then we also have the source video, which is an MP4 here, and then we have a couple inputs hard-coded. Now, in the past videos, I showed you how you could create all this in the fly in JavaScript, but what I'm doing instead is I'm just hiding it by default, and then I'm revealing it in the JavaScript. So it's there hard-coded along with all these input fields, just because this is a lot to create in JavaScript on the fly. You could do it, but at a certain point, you want to decide, hey, this is better for me to save in a template somewhere and load up somehow, or save in a template and hide and then reveal it. But what we're going to look at, as you could probably guess, is how to make the play, pause, go to beginning, and then update the timestamp as it goes. So let's jump back into our JavaScript and notice, first thing I've done is I've removed our parent element. So remember, this was here in our other examples. I'm working all from the same HTML just for this one thing. And so we remove that. And then if I didn't do display block in our CSS, this is set to display none. So in the other examples, this wasn't showing up, but now I'm going to change this on the fly. So again, we're just looking at some different ways here to hide and reveal things that we might need. Now let's scroll to the bottom. You'll notice that in this convention of the way I'm writing these, I've got some functions up here that are written a little bit different. Can you remember the difference between a function like this and a function like that and what they're called? We haven't really gotten too much into the benefit of writing them more like this, but because this is just a demo, I'm doing it quick and dirty. So with these examples, don't really copy and paste these into production quite yet. We'll learn more about the best ways to work with functions and events as we go on, but this is just to serve as a demo for now. So we set up all of our functions up top here, and then down below is where we add what are called event listeners, which we haven't talked about yet. Again, these are just demos to get you familiar with what's coming. So what we have is we have a couple click ones. We say when the play button is clicked, then run the function play video. When the pause button is clicked, pause the video. When the restart, etc. And then finally, when the video element, or on the video element itself, we have an event listener that has a special function, or a special event. This is built into JavaScript in the DOM. So whenever the time is updated, then we're going to run our own custom code. And what you should begin to see at this point is that there are all sorts of custom events, and we'll explore some of them, and I'll teach you how to explore the rest of them. There are hundreds of them, literally. And so one of them that exists is how to update the timestamp, or whenever a video is updated, then do something. So the play video, pause video, and restart video are all super simple. We grab the video element just by query selector, whatever the video element is. There's only one on the page for this, so it's a little bit easier. And then we're simply going to run play. This is built into JavaScript, so all we have to do is play, pause. Restart video is a little bit differently in that we're going to set the current time, which is a property of the video element, back to 0. Pretty simple. And then finally, the update timestamp, what we're doing is we're going to get the current timestamp. Notice that here we set the current time to 0. Here we're grabbing it on the fly, converting it into a whole number, and then updating the inner HTML of our timestamp. So this is all the basic foundation of stuff that we've looked at before. We're just learning some new things in relation to events specifically. So let's test it out here. I'm going to click play. And notice that when I click play, it moved forward. When I click pause, it paused. I could click play again. Pause again. Okay, then I'm going to click go to beginning now, which is basically going to reset the timestamp back to 0 so I can move it anywhere, click go to beginning, and then it moves back. And the timestamp, this is super exciting and cool. What this allows us to do is we can move it, and notice that any time that it's updated, even if the video isn't playing, we're still going to be able to update our timestamp. And then if I click play again, notice that that timestamp is being updated on the fly. Not just video, but audio as well, all sorts of media. So that's our little sneak preview example of working with media events. Okay, now in this example, we're going to be looking at drag and drop. And you might have thought this was super complex and hard to do with JavaScript, but thanks to some HTML5 additions and some basic JavaScript with events, we can do some pretty cool drag and drop. So notice that I'm changing the cursor, I'm updating the style, I'm highlighting the drop zone. It moved it. I could also do copy as well. Notice a different styling for that. Copy multiple ones in. And just think about, before we look at the code here, what's going on. I'm going to refresh it. You know how to hover when we don't know how to drag yet, but you know how to change the styling. I'm changing the styling of this. When the mouse enters into a new area or it hovers over it, then I'm going to change some other styles. And then finally, we don't know how to deal with drop yet, but we know how to remove something from one area and append it to the other. This one is simply the same thing, and it's using the clone feature behind the scenes. We looked at the clone before, we just didn't know how to tie it to events like drag and drop. So here I'm doing a lot of stuff to set up the page. I'm grabbing some elements behind the scenes. Again, I'm hiding the child element that was there before, and I'm taking some drag and drop stuff that was in the original markup. Let's see, we got our drag and drop section here, so that's all in the markup. Again, I could have created this on the fly, but I'm not going to. And notice the only difference is that one of these I'm saying move and one copy. The other thing is that in HTML, and we looked at this way back when we looked at some form elements and different types of attributes we could have on things, that we could assign draggable to any element thanks to HTML5. Now, by its own, it won't do anything, it won't work, but we need to set up this in our HTML in order for our JavaScript to work as well. So once we do that, I'm going to come all the way down to the bottom because we set up all our functions first. I'll make this a bit smaller so we could see it all in one line. Notice that we're saying, all right, if we have something that's movable, that's going to be this guy. When we start dragging, do some special code. When we end dragging, do some special code. The copyable one, when we start dragging that, do some special code, but we don't have anything when we end. Okay, that's a little weird. I'll mention why that is in a moment. And then our droppable area, that's going to be this right here. Notice that way back up top here. I said movable is going to be anything with the move class, the first thing with move class. Copyable, anything, or the first thing with the copy class. And then droppable is this right here. This has the droppable class assigned to it. So then I'm going to say, okay, when we enter into it or we drag over it, we're actually going to do the same thing. Notice that the same thing is being called in both of these situations. And then when we leave over it, I'm going to do something else. So that's what allows us to style it when we hover over it, but then when we unhover, then we're going to unstyle it. So it's pretty simple. And then this is where the magic happens. When we drop down, make sure that we do the actual code that we want it to do. Okay, so let's look back through these now that we know what's going on. So movable drag start handler. Again, these conventions and all this naming and stuff will make more sense as we go on later. But what we're doing is we're saying, okay, whatever it was, event target, this will become clear later what that means. But if whatever it is that we're dragging has the class copy, then do this. If it says it's move, if it has the move class, then go ahead and do this as well. And notice that we're taking the thing that we're moving and we're adding a class of active to it. So in our CSS, we have some CSS that's basically styling this with some dashed border and changing the color. So it's nothing fancy there. All we're doing is applying a new class, a new style onto it. And then we are going to do something a bit more complex, and we're going to save some of the data. We'll skip over that for now, what's really happening. And then when it ends, what do we have to do? If I drag this and then I let it go someplace else, notice that the style changes back. That doesn't happen by default. That happens because we're removing the class. The same thing if I drag this over and then I let go, notice that the styling goes back to normal. It doesn't change or it doesn't stay as the highlighted green like this. As soon as I let go, it's gone. So that's what's happening here. We're removing the classes. Then we've got some droppable enter. When this happens, we have to do this prevent default. This will allow our drop to actually work. And then again, we're just adding the class of active. So when you get over this area here, just add the class of active, and that's what's making this whole drop zone have the green dashed border and the green background. This isn't automatic. We can make it look whatever we want, but that's what's happening there. If we leave that area, we're removing the class active. And then here's where the real magic happens. Here's what happens when we drop it. So some of this won't make too much sense. So I'll skip over a few things, but I want to point out what we're doing here is we're saying if whatever it is that we dragged has copy inside the class list. So we're basically testing it. When we let go, we're saying, hey, does what I let go of have a class of move, or does it have a class of copy? And if it has a class of copy, then we're going to clone it and then append it into the droppable area. It's so simple. So this stuff of clone